Good afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on the earliest days of Israel. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to move on from Bronze Age Canaan to understand the earliest evidence for an entirely new cultural group, known as the Israelites or the Hebrews in the Holy Land. In doing so, we'll weave together narratives from the Old Testament of the Bible, along with archaeological and historical evidence from outside sources. This will give us the historical background necessary to understand the rise of monotheistic Judaism, which has shaped the history of Israel and the world for centuries to come. So pack your bags and let's head for the Holy Land as we investigate the earliest days of Israel. Now, during the Bronze Age, a diverse set of cultures inhabited the Holy Land, growing crops, building cities, and trading with one another. But none, as far as we can tell archaeologically, was distinctly Israeli or Hebrew or Jewish. So the question then is where and when did the ancient Israelites arise? Now, the earliest mention of Israel in historical records can be found in the famous Stela of Merneptah, an ancient Egyptian inscription dating back to the 13th century BC, precisely sometime between 1213 and 1203 BC. Now, a stela is a large stone upright slab, and this one was inscribed, and Merneptah was one of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. This particular stela was discovered in 1896 at the site of Thebes, and now it's housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And it provides invaluable insights into the geopolitical landscape of the region during the reign of the Pharaoh Merneptah. Now, the inscription on the stela recounts the military campaigns and victories achieved by the pharaoh, including his campaign against a coalition of enemies in the land of Canaan. In one of the lines, Merneptah boasts about his triumph over various peoples, stating, "Israel is laid to waste, his seed is no more." Now, this context suggests that Israel was not merely kind of a small village or an insignificant settlement, but it was a group of people and one that was recognized as a kind of noteworthy presence in the region. Now, shortly after 1200 BC, other archaeological evidence suggests the rise of a new cultural group, one that we might call the Israelites. This new group can be seen as distinct from their previous Canaanite group in several important ways. So one striking feature of this new group is the absence of pig bones within their archaeological sites. While pigs were commonly consumed in the neighboring kind of Canaanite camps, their scarcity at Israeli sites suggests a cultural and religious aversion to pig consumption. This aligns with biblical prohibitions on eating pork and reinforces the notion of a distinct Israelite identity and unique dietary practices. Now, another key archaeological indicator is pottery. And Israelite pottery, known as Israelite monochrome or collared rimware, stands out with specific decorative techniques and unique vessel forms. And it's kind of known for being much plainer than the fine decorated pottery of the surrounding groups. Excavations of early Iron Age sites, dating all the way back to 900 BC, have found inscriptions that mention biblical characters as well. The earliest of these, from the site of Tel Dan, is known as the Tel Dan Stela, and it has an inscription that mentions, quote-unquote, the House of David, which not only mentions the kind of famous biblical figure, but it also references something known as the House of Yahweh. And so this inscription suggests the existence of a dedicated temple or shrine to the god Yahweh at the site of Tel Dan during this period. And so we get the picture, not of Israelites arriving out of some exodus, or that may have happened in some small sort of way, but we don't have that picture or evidence for a large scale kind of emigration out of Egypt into Israel, but rather emerging and becoming kind of distinct from Canaanite groups that already inhabited the land. They lived in small villages, started new customs, and, as it appears, began to worship new gods. The Tel Dan inscription gives us one of the earliest non-biblical pieces of evidence for Yahweh, the name of the God that the Israelites worshipped. The Bible, although it was likely written far later, probably only starting around 700 BC, gives us much greater detail on the characters of this early stage of Israel. We call this early period the unified monarchy, before the kingdoms of Israel and Judah split up. And scholars still debate the accuracy of these tales, whether the individuals and the unified monarchy as a whole really existed at all. But if it did, most scholars would place this sometime between maybe 1100, the 11th century BC, and the kind of 1000s BC. Now, according to the Bible, the first king of the Israelites was named Saul, who was anointed by the prophet Samuel and initially enjoyed great military success. However, his reign was marred by personal struggles and disobedience to God, ultimately leading to his downfall and death. Next, we have David, a shepherd turned warrior, famed for defeating the Philistine giant Goliath and succeeding Saul as king. He is portrayed as a charismatic and skilled leader, known for his victories in battle and his musical talents. David established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and desired to build a permanent dwelling place for Yahweh, the God of Israel. However, due to his involvement in warfare, God instructed him to pass the task of constructing that temple to his son, Solomon. Solomon, then, is renowned for his wisdom and wealth, and he ascended to the throne after David's death. Under his rule, Israel experienced a period of unprecedented prosperity and influence. Solomon embarked upon a grand endeavor of building the first temple of Jerusalem, also known as Solomon's Temple or the Temple of Solomon. This temple, described in detail in the biblical accounts, was a magnificent structure adorned with precious metals and fine woods and intricate craftsmanship. And most historians guess this happened somewhere around 1000 BC. Now, the construction of the temple symbolized the establishment of a permanent religious center and a symbol of Yahweh's presence among the Israelites. The temple became the focal point of religious worship, housing such artifacts as the Ark of the Covenant and serving as a place for sacrifices and ceremonies. It also solidified Jerusalem as the spiritual and political heart of the Israelite kingdom. The account of the temple's construction highlights Solomon's extensive resources and the contributions of skilled craftsmen and laborers. The biblical narrative describes the elaborate planning, the procurement of materials from foreign allies, and the dedication of the temple with a solemn ceremony attended by a multitude of people. The construction of the first temple of Solomon represents a pivotal moment in biblical history, emphasizing the significance of Jerusalem and the centrality of religious worship in the lives of the Israelites. It served as a testament to the power and influence of the unified monarchy under King David and King Solomon, and it left an indelible mark on the religious and cultural heritage of the Israelite people. After Solomon's death, the unified monarchy was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division weakened the Israelites, leaving them sort of vulnerable to external threats. Now, traditionally, these smaller kingdoms were named after the 12 sons of Jacob, who is seen as the patriarch of the Israelites. 10 of these tribes were in the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 of them, Judah and Benjamin, made up the kingdom of Judah. The invasion of Shoshank I, an Egyptian pharaoh, also known as Shishak in the Bible, into Israel started a series of foreign invasions. So Shoshank I was the pharaoh of Egypt's 22nd dynasty, and his military campaign into Israel took place in the 10th century or the 900s BC. The invasion is recorded, and this is what's cool, both in the biblical account, in the book of 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, but also on the monumental inscriptions of Shoshank I himself at sites like Karnak and Bubastis. The invasion was a response to the weakened state of the Kingdom of Judah following the division of the unified monarchy, and Shoshank's forces targeted various cities, including Jerusalem, capturing treasures from the temple and the royal palace. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel, in particular, faced continuous struggles against Assyrian invasions. And this ultimately led to its downfall in 722 BC and the exile of all its inhabitants. So after a siege lasting several years, the Assyrians breached the defenses at the northern Israelite capital of Samaria. And this led to the capture and exile of a significant portion of the Israelite population. This led to the end of the northern kingdom, and it marked the dispersion of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. And this is what we call today the lost tribes of Israel. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, King Hezekiah was strengthening its capital at Jerusalem, instituting some building programs like the Broad Wall and the defensive fortifications and the Siloam Tunnel, which can still all be seen archaeologically today. It's really cool, things going all the way back to biblical times. By building these works, Hezekiah was able to repel the attack of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. And we have archaeological evidence in the form of small royal seals for the actual historical existence of King Hezekiah. So again, not just from the Bible, but also from archaeological remains, operating sometime around 700 BC. Thus, while the 10 tribes of northern Israel were lost, the kingdom of Judah, from which the term Jewish derives, ended up actually growing in power. But unfortunately, this was not to last. Now, due to their strategic location between the Mesopotamian empires of the Near East and the Egyptian Empire in the Nile River Valley, the kind of smallish kingdoms of Israel and Judah could never quite avoid these much larger empires, most of whom had some pretty cruel intentions. We just saw that the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered and scattered in 722 BC by the Assyrians. Now, a century and a half later, the Babylonians had come for the southern kingdom of Judah. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar II, led a siege of the kingdom of Judah and its capital city of Jerusalem. A truly cataclysmic event that left an indelible mark on the history of ancient Israel. The siege led to a prolonged and agonizing famine within the city walls, weakening its defenses and the resolve of its inhabitants to put up a defense. Ultimately, the Babylonians breached the walls, unleashing a wave of destruction upon the Jewish people inside the city of Jerusalem. The city was ransacked, including the sacred and revered First Temple of Solomon, which was reduced to ruins. This act of desecration devastated the Israelites, as the temple held immense religious and cultural significance as the central place of worship for Yahweh. The sack of Judah resulted in the exile of a large portion of the Judite population, known as the Babylonian exile or the Babylonian captivity. Many were forcibly taken to Babylon, where they would spend decades in a foreign land, longing for their homeland and wrestling with questions of identity and faith and national destiny. The destruction of Jerusalem and the exile brought about by a period of deep reflection and soul-searching among the exiled community gave rise to new forms of religious expression and a kind of reimagining of their relationship with their God Yahweh. The sack of Judah by the Babylonians marked the end of an era, the end of the First Temple era, and it shattered the political and religious institutions of Judah. But it did, however, set the stage for a new chapter in the history of ancient Israel. Okay, now, as we've told the tales of the early days of Israel in this lecture, we've seen that we've got different types of sources that provide evidence for major events. So the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament of the Bible, right, the same thing there, provides the most detail for many of these events. However, the distinction between kind of historical fact and mythological fiction within these texts has long been a subject of scholarly debate. So what's true and what's not? Well, that's a tricky question. Let's start with the Bible itself, or at least the Old Testament, or what we call the Hebrew Bible. Now, scholars believe that the Hebrew Bible started to be written down around 700 BC. But it didn't all happen at once. In fact, it was added to and edited and revised over the course of about half a millennium, about 500 years, all the way until around 200 BC. Now, some of the time, the Bible actually falls, some of the events within the Bible actually fall within this span. So things like what we just talked about, right? The destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC, that's right in the middle of the time frame. But some other events would have occurred way, way earlier, probably during the Bronze Age or during the Bronze Age collapse, around 1300 or 1200 or 1100 BC. And these would be events like the Exodus from Egypt, or the wandering in the desert, or the conquest of Canaan and the destruction of sites like Jericho. And so even if those things did occur, the person writing about them would have been doing so 500 or 600 years after the fact. The other important thing that you have to remember is that the Bible is not meant to be a historical text. And here's what I mean by that, right? At least not in the way that we kind of think about history. So the goal wasn't to get things like factually correct. Instead, the Bible had a slew of kind of like social and political and cultural and religious functions that were far more important to the ancient writers and the ancient readers than being factually right. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing historically correct, right? Many of the foreign conquests, for example, have multiple strands of evidence that we can confirm in different cultures, both from the Bible and from the conquering group. So, for example, Shoshank's 10th century BC conquest of Egypt, or from Egypt into the Holy Land, is recorded both in the Bible and in Egyptian texts. We can feel confident that occurred. Likewise, the Assyrian conquest of the 8th century has both Assyrian sources and biblical references. We can feel confident that's correct. Same goes for the Babylonian conquest and exile of 586 BC, right? We have both Babylonian sources and biblical sources. We can feel good about that. But some of the events, especially when you get back to the really, really early stuff, well, they're really difficult to confirm. And to do so, you'd need to look at the archaeological evidence. Now, one area to do this would be to look at the conquest of Canaan. And in the Bible, this is supposed to be a very violent event. So let's take a look at Jericho as an example. So here's what the book of Joshua says in the aftermath. Quote, "The priests blew the trumpets. As soon as the army heard the sound, they let out a loud shout. Then the wall fell down. Everyone charged straight in, so they took the city. They set it apart to the Lord to be destroyed. They destroyed every living thing in it with their swords. They killed the men. They killed the women. They wiped out the young people. They wiped out the old people. They destroyed the cattle. They destroyed the sheep. They destroyed the donkeys." They even killed the poor donkeys. Anyway, based on the earliest information about the presence of the Israelites in the land of Canaan, we think that this happened likely sometime around 1200 BC, right? Sometime in the late Bronze Age or at the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse. And archaeologists have excavated Jericho. And what's really cool, there is actually a massive wall at the site. In fact, it is one of the most ancient massive walls in all the world. It originally dates back all the way to around 8000 BC. It's really, really cool. And these walls continued to be built up and revised over the course of millennia. However, by the time of the Bronze Age, the site ends up getting totally destroyed what appears to be some time in the middle of the Bronze Age, right? This is the site and the walls. And so what this means is by the time Joshua and the Israelites would have shown up in the late Bronze Age, sometime around 13 or 1200 BC, there would have been no fortification wall to bring tumbling down. So in this instance, the archaeology doesn't quite match up with the biblical story very well. And in fact, when we look at the big picture, there really isn't a lot of archaeological evidence for a clear kind of violent conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, right? We don't see destruction layers at the site followed by an Israelite presence afterwards. Instead, we see a small group of settlements emerge, almost evolving out or from their Canaanite predecessors, but now with a different type of pottery and with different eating habits. And the existence of many of Israel's early kings, right, during the unified monarchy, kings like Saul and David and Solomon, even existence is still honestly debated by scholars today. There's just no clear consensus. Now, things like the Tel Dan stela, which mentions the House of David, does provide some evidence for the fact that they did exist, or at least the fact that people several centuries later thought they existed. And so what we can see, right, this was created several centuries after the fact or after David would have ruled, and again, it provides evidence that it is probably the case, but again, there's no clear consensus. That being said, of the many places discussed in the Bible, they have been excavated, and many were destroyed at some point, even if the chronology doesn't quite match what the Bible says exactly. This is all to say that it's important to really investigate the sources that you use to put together a history of a region. Texts like the Bible aren't just historical texts, right? They serve religious and moral and theological purposes, and they convey spiritual teachings that reflect the beliefs and values of the ancient Israelite society. But at the same time, they're not just mythologies either, and they certainly contain facets of historical events. Moreover, this isn't unique to the Bible, right? Rather, this kind of blending of historical events with mythological and literary and political elements, it's a common theme throughout Near Eastern writings during this time period at the Late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. This is all just a reminder that it's really important to investigate the sources that you use when you're putting together the history of an area and a people and a religion. The earliest days of Israel occur sometime during the early Iron Age in the Holy Land, sometime around 1200 BC, and it goes until around 586 BC with the destruction of the first Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. From the united monarchy under David and Solomon to the division of the kingdom, the exile, and the subsequent return, these centuries were marked by political upheavals and religious reforms and the resilience of the Israelites. The legacy of this area laid the groundwork for the religious and cultural traditions that would define ancient Israel and have a lasting impact on its people for centuries to come.